everyone. Thank you for coming out today. My name is Christine Solstice, for those of you who know me, for those of you who don't. I've been a writer for about 10 years now. I've only started publishing about 5 years ago. My most recent release is Reclusive 2038. It's a futuristic society that, the Earth has kind of changed. We've run out of resources. Being able to drive is now a rarity. The common people kind of have to live in safe communities. And they're regulated by a company. It's called the company. It's kind of just like a general term for them. The wealthy took over, but they're still able to live freely outside the gates. But they're also living in an Earth that isn't the same as what we have right now. So while they have the freedoms and luxuries of living out there, they don't quite get to be as happy. They don't have all of society like working for them and everything as they used to. And then there's one more group called the Renegades. Now, they're not the cool types of rebels that, you're like kind of like, I want to be one of them. They are more like violent and angry. They'll they'll take anything they can off you. They're like scavengers. And they come to points where their like attacks are less and they can't attack as much, because what happens is they start running out of fuels of their own. If they can't like steal whatever they get, then they have to, they're starting to die off. They're going to die off before anyone else because of the way they live. Does anybody know the difference between a dystopian society and an apocalyptic one? Because a lot of people don't seem to... I'm sorry, go ahead.
Just want you to know that.
The world never ended? I mean, did something horrible didn't happen to make it go this way? I mean, a dystopian usually means that it's something that things are bad, but the apocalyptic seems to think that everything kind of blew up, or everyone died, or...
Yeah, a dystopian society is generally characterized by dehumanization, oppression, a society that changes, is regulated, the people do not have as much joy in their lives, but there's no end threat at that point. It's just a society that's different. It's not as free as what we have at present. But then an apocalyptic one occurs when something, if you think about like a zombie attack, or, the aliens coming down and wiping out most of existence. And then post-apocalyptic, after that, is when there are just a few survivors left. So a lot of people sometimes will mix them all together. Now I'm sure they can go hand in hand in a story, like you would move into a dystopian future that would become apocalyptic. But I usually like to, because a lot of people, they're like, what is a dystopia? And I just tell them a good way to think of it is just to remember something that is the opposite of utopia. It's not a society that's happy. Although one of my first literary influences was Brave New World. Has anybody here read that? No? Oh, it's a great one. Aldous Huxley. Frank's raising his hand back there. It's a great book, and I was actually in high school when I first read that one. I wasn't a writer at that point. I didn't know I was even going to be one. But it was one of those novels that whenever you read it, it sticks with you. You kind of don't forget it. It's in the future. They manufacture people. So people are created for the life that they're supposed to live. You have alphas, betas, deltas, gammas. Everybody is given their position in society. There is no natural birth. And like any person who would have a natural birth is called a savage. So that is another example of dystopia. How about 1984? How many of you read that? 1984? That's a book that really puts the fear in you. How many of you were a little bit like, I don't want to live in this society? That's definitely. And we're seeing a rise right now in books like that. We kind of have the Hunger Games and things like that. My Reclusive 2038 was to pay homage to sort of like Brave New World and things like that, because that is kind of the first experience that I had, and I kind of grew up always wanting to try it out. So I do put a couple references in it. And does anybody have any questions at this point? Any sorts of questions? Okay. Well, I think I'm going to read you some of Reclusive 2038, and then if you want to discuss any more of that. I know it's a weekend of graduations and birthday parties. We're moving into summer, so I won't keep you too long today. Okay, but where I'm going to start out with is it's on chapter 4, and this is one of the people, the common people. Linda Taggart, she is our main character, and she's stuck in this, her being a zoo animal, as she's called, and she's stuck there, but she wants more, and you can just tell. But because she can't drive, anytime they transport you, and the world is separated into units, like you have a unit with family, like single people live in one, then you have a unit that has family. So they don't even mix like people based on their demographics. They mix them on their demographics, but they don't mix them like people who actually have diseases or in their own. It's just a whole like separation of people to kind of keep population down and things like that. So this is her first experience when she has to go transport to see like her sister who lives in the family unit. Okay, so, all right. Linda took the elevator to the controller's office where she was greeted by 2 uniformed officers. Ms. Taggart, one began, nodding at her. We are here to escort you outside. Linda nodded and followed them. Immediately they started down a gray carpeted corridor towards the doors that led them into open sunlight. As they walked, one of the officers spoke, briefing her in a very stern and direct tone. The convoy is equipped with all the materials you will need for a safe and comfortable ride. It is our hybrid G60 model, complete with motion sickness controls. However, that does not mean that the natural turbulence will not affect you. There is a button directly in front for the cooling fan, for motion sickness control, for heat, for dim or dark lighting, and for emergency ejection. Everything is easily labeled, much better than the last trip you took on the G40 model. He began, and then looked down at the paper, 3 years ago, to the same destination. In addition, you will find that this outside scenery has changed a bit. Do not be alarmed. We would appreciate it if all passengers took medication before boarding in order to make the transition just as comfortable for all the others. Hurriedly they walked, the urgency climbing with every step. Linda's eyes darted nervously around her, studying the scene. She stopped and looked beyond the walls. Sudden fear and anxiety coursed through her. One of the officers stopped beside her. "Miss Taggart, are you okay?" he asked. "It's perfectly healthy to be nervous," he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of strawberry candy. She recognized it immediately as a sedative it was, but she had sworn them off early in the beginning. They reminded her of the Soma in Brave New World. "No thanks," Linda said. The officer continued to hand it to her. "You can hold on to it just in case you change your mind," he said. Reluctantly, Linda took it from him, slipping it into her pocket. Her heart raced in thousands of directions. She followed the officers toward the bus convoy. He put his hand out in front of her, guiding her forward. Linda stepped onto the stairs, taking notice that her legs were shaking to near complete weakness. Her next leg missed the step, and she began to fall to the side. The officer caught her and her bag, steadying her straight. "Thank you," she said. Her voice choked out behind her. Her heart raced. Linda's eyes dizzied in her head. As she reached the top of the bus, her eyes coursed over the passengers like a deer in headlights. It was an old saying from a time before this. It was a saying from a time when people drove their own cars, when people weren't filled with so much fear. This surrounded her. Almost every eye inside the convoy bus dreamt of crying. Linda could see it. She could read it in their eyes. Men, women, all of these singular entities held a dash of nervousness that expedited their heart into a sprinting race. Together, they were united in fear. But there were many others who didn't look that way. Those ones were calm. But underneath that facade of calmness was a sedative-like answer for their shared anxiety. Still others who had taken their candy sooner leaned against the window, entirely asleep. Before she knew it, Linda had forced herself forward. She was walking blindly to the first available seat. She plopped herself quickly into it, pulling the seatbelt into place. Linda dropped her bag onto the seat beside her and put her head back against the seat. No one tried to talk to her, and she was glad. It was just the way they were, the way they had become, reclusive. With her head still back against the seat, Linda tried to ease the craziness of her internal thoughts of her heart. She wanted to lean her head against the window, but instead she thought she would be safer to keep her distance from it, just in case the renegades attacked. Everyone around her had the same fear. What if? Linda looked at the clock built into the bus convoy. The shape of this contraption modeled those of school buses, only with a more rounded, tank-like structure. The hybrid vehicle was lined with bulletproof glass. This hybrid used solar power and less gas, cutting its emissions. The company spared no expense for its transport, and this was why the renegades were always trying to get their hands on the technology. Linda looked around. No more passengers stepped on after her. The door shut, and her stomach and chest seemed to seize up on her. The vehicle began to slowly move. Motion sickness instantly rose up in her. She swiftly pushed a button in front of her seat, and a bag immediately popped open, catching her sickness just in time. Linda then took a napkin from the dispenser and wiped her mouth. Slowly, she looked over at the passenger beside her. He was fast asleep. Linda sat back and took the motion sickness tablets that were provided on the bus next to the tissue dispenser. She put them in her mouth, allowing them to slowly dissolve. She pushed another button and used the bag along with its contents until they flattened into the seat. Another sound followed, a familiar sound that signified disinfection. Around her, the sounds of motion sickness filled the convoy. The familiar bursting bag, the tissue sounds, and the button of disinfection all fell in sequence with one another. A clean scent rose amongst them. Linda held her waist and looked out the window. They were approaching the gates, ready to leave the community. Her motion sickness began to subside, but her fear returned full force. The gates opened so slowly, seeming to mock her already rapidly beating pulse. She felt nauseous again. Could her nerves really be so much stronger than the medication? The bus moved through the gates. Fear attacked her. She couldn't do this. She didn't want to leave her safe home. Why? The voice screamed inside of her like a disobedient child, but it was interrupted by a real voice that came out over the intercom. Passengers, please be calm. We are now leaving single unit en route to your destinations. Please remain in your seats and calmly so. Enjoy the trip and thank you. Linda shook her head, struggling against herself. She turned and looked behind her. Distraught faces looked back at her with fear flushing their existence. As Linda looked, many of them popped the strawberry candy into their mouths. She blinked rapidly and turned forward again, watching the gates that they were now driving out of. She looked back once again out the window, seeing those ugly gray replicated buildings standing amongst each other. She hated the landscape of those buildings all the time, but now she yearned for them. She wanted to go back. Linda's heart thudded impatiently. She fell hard back into her seat. Her eyes squeamishly looked around her. She reached in her pocket, pulling out the candy. The plastic crinkled under her fingertips. She had to, just this time. Hurriedly, Linda unwrapped it. She put the candy in her mouth, savoring the sweet strawberry flavor, allowing it to slowly dissolve. She leaned back in her seat, allowing the effects to slowly take over. Linda began to feel a wave of equanimity wash over her, and slowly this began to equal out her equilibrium. She felt coldly numb, paralyzed from life, just like the day before where she had felt nothing. Only this seemed purer because it wasn't her fault that she felt nothing right now. It was the drug. Okay, so that's just one of the first ones, and that's kind of sums up how a person would change if they were subjected to a life where, you know, like if there was fossil fuel decline. And another thing that I forgot to mention is that in this society, global temperature rises, so between the hours of 9 a.m. and 6 p.m., you're not allowed to go outside. And that's one of the things that shows how oppressed they are. So they have to leave at like 6 p.m. if they want to go transport to another place. So they become like obsessed with their gadgets. And I'm sure we all can familiarize ourselves with that, because I kind of took like what it seemed like some of our trends in life were to when I was creating this book too. I'm just going to read another briefer one, and this is going to give you kind of a taste of what the elitists are like. So this one's a bit shorter. Okay, and her name, Madeline Kingman. She's a young 20-something-year-old girl who is kind of irresponsible, as you'll see. And this is just introducing the elitists. Madeline's fingers tapped the steering wheel as she waited for her friend. She looked into the rearview mirror at her reflection, checking her big, beautiful brown eyes against her wildly flowing dark hair. Madeline noted that her makeup was a bit too dark today, but she was satisfied that she was as beautiful as ever. As she admired herself, her friend Marla finally got into the passenger side, dragging along a half-gallon of whiskey with her. Madeline rolled her eyes. "You know I don't like whiskey," she said. Marla took a big swig and then smiled at her friend. "Well, I do," Marla replied. Madeline rolled her eyes and started the car. Really, she didn't like Marla, but she was one of the few girls around her age to hang out with. Marla smoothed her straight blonde hair away from her face and went to take another sip of the whiskey bottle. Madeline smiled wickedly and started the car forward, quickly hitting the brake, causing Marla to spill the brownish liquid all over her white shirt. "Ah!" Marla shrieked angrily. "Why did you do that?" Madeline hit the gas and took off even faster, defiantly tossing her head back as she squared her shoulders. "I told you I don't like whiskey," Madeline replied. "You should have brought something for me." Marla scoffed. "You just ruined my shirt. My father brought in someone special to make this shirt," she complained. Well, you better buckle up or that won't be the only mess you wear, Madeline said. You are so cruel, Marla commented. Madeline slammed her foot against the gas pedal, pushing it down harder and faster as they moved. Marla rolled her eyes and buckled her seatbelt, knowing that Madeline was a horrible driver. If only her daddy would let her drive a car of her own, then Marla wouldn't have to hang out with Madeline so much. Where are we going? Marla asked. Madeline shrugged. I don't know. There's nowhere to go. We're just going to drive. Want to go tease the zoo animals? Marla asked. Her eyes grew wide with excitement. Nah, boring. Marla's eyes widened again. Want to go spy on the renegades? She asked. Madeline shook her head. Nah, they're too mean, she replied. But they always have some really killer drugs, Marla begged. Madeline shook her head. No plans, no destination. We're just going to ride. Marla pouted in her seat. Madeline could tell from the corner of her eye. Hand me that bottle, she said. Madeline's speed only increased. Marla rolled her eyes. I thought you didn't like whiskey. Madeline shrugged. I'm thirsty. Anything will do. Marla handed her the bottle. Take the wheel, Madeline said. Marla reached out and held the wheel as Madeline lifted the bottle from her. Madeline drank from it like she was a baby and it was milk. Afterwards, she made a sour face, handing it back to Marla as she took the wheel again. That stuff really is nasty, Madeline said. I like it, Marla remarked. Marla put the bottle to her mouth again. They were quiet for a while as they rode through the hot summer day, just passing the bottle back and forth. Marla's eyes grew big. Why don't we go see Kevin and Connor? Marla asked. They were two of the half-dozen elitist boys closest in age to them. Nah, I'm tired of making out with them, Madeline replied. We could trade this time, Marla suggested. Nah, we're just going to drive, Madeline said. Madeline saw Marla pouting in the seat beside her again. Even if she did want to see the guys, Madeline was acutely against anything Marla suggested. After all, it was her car, not Marla's. Madeline swerved back and forth, speeding recklessly as she went. Marla hit her head against the top of the car a few times, cursed at Madeline, sipped her bottle, and then passed it back to the driver. This was a typical day for them. The sun was shining brightly, but they were equipped with sunscreen and ready to party their days away. All of a sudden, the engine started sputtering as she drove. Madeline looked down at the computer screen, trying to diagnose the problem. A blue and red screen flashed in warning, and then a voice spoke from the dashboard. Alternator needs replaced. Alternator needs replaced. You are low on gas. You are low on gas. Madeline groaned loudly, but continued speeding. Aren't you going to stop and let it get fixed? Marla asked. Madeline pushed the gas pedal to the floor, but didn't say anything. What the bleep are you doing? Marla shouted. Madeline had switched paths and was aiming directly for a large boulder on the side of the road. The car shouted its new warning. Obstacle ahead, warning, obstacle ahead. But instead of the car speeding into it, the vehicle began to slow to a stop, puttering as it went. Finally, it stopped just seconds before crashing into the boulder. Madeline smashed her fists against the dashboard, cursing. The car began to speak again. Alternator is being replaced. Alternator is being replaced. Fuel is being filled. Fuel is being filled. Marla was staring at her, dumbfounded. You're, expletive, crazy, Marla said. Madeline pushed her head back indignantly. She turned to Marla and rolled her eyes. I know you don't have a car yet, but you should understand that all cars have duplicate parts. The engine fixes itself. The only problem is that the pieces of junk can't do it while you're driving. I didn't stop because I tried to make it fix itself, and unfortunately it didn't work. Okay, so that was part of the elitists. You can tell they're very different, and they're the very few people in society that can possess a car. Okay, does anyone have any questions or anything right now? No? Okay. There's just a very, very short clip of the Renegades that I'm going to read you. Now, Linda's life changes, and she gets to escape. Well, I'll just spoil that for you right now. She does get to escape, and her life very much changes. So she actually learns how to drive at the age of 36. And I'm just going to read a very short clip of what happens when she's driving her own car, too, in this crazy, chaotic world. Okay, now she's driving, and she's also, because they're advanced cars, they give you warnings. Only a few more minutes into her drive, the car screen flashed a warning before it spoke. Obstacle, 80 feet ahead. Take another direction. 80 feet ahead? The landscape ahead was all curves, with nothing visible to the human eye. Linda slowed down quickly, causing the car to jolt a bit. When she was down to 40 miles per hour, she cautiously eyed the narrow road she had just entered. On her right was a high mountain of brown rocks standing up in the sky above. On the left was a cliff that promised a deep dive over the edge of nature. There was no place to turn around now. Fear beat at Linda's heart as she wondered what was ahead on the next turn. This road was much curvier than any of the others, like a serpentine spread out in a garden, and she could see nothing in the distance. Perhaps she would just turn around once she reached this obstacle. Still, fear bounced through her like a scared child lost in a dark tunnel. Her heart galloped and she swallowed hard. Edward would have told her if something was wrong with the roadway, but then she realized she had taken a different way, and he hadn't known that she would. Damn, she whined. Maybe just find a place to turn around, she said to herself. The road ahead just continued along the windy cliff. Just the thought of turning around on this downward grade frightened Linda to no end. Linda pushed a button on the screen to see if there were more details of the obstacle ahead. Perhaps she could find a picture, but she hadn't ever used this screen before on her drives, and right now she had no idea how to work it. Slowly, Linda drove along one of the sharpest curves in the road. This was not a road to speed on, with or without obstacles ahead. Linda let the car go with the curve, but just as she turned the next corner, she wished she had turned around elsewhere, even on the narrowest of cliffs. Linda's face instantly flushed with the sweltering heat of fear. She swallowed hard as she felt her heart going insane inside her chest. Tears instantly burst from her cheeks as she saw the image ahead of her. Men, about a dozen of them, all wearing ragged, ripped, and dirty clothes and carrying large guns, stood there in front of an older-style car, completely blocking the road. Renegades. Okay, so that's what I have for you all. And any questions now, or any favorite dystopian or apocalyptic movies or books that you want to talk about? I just watched one called Fortress, and it was a few, I very much liked dystopian societies, but it was a pretty scary one too. It was kind of like when they were in prisons, and they would actually make you ingest a little metal ball, and if you were out of line, they called it intestinate, and they would click it, and you would have so much pain you'd fall to your knees, and that was how they controlled all of their prisoners and things like that. Okay, but again, my name is Christine Soltis. I'm also doing a webisode called SolsticeNightSky Productions. That's kind of what the little cameras are in here for too as well. And I want to thank you all for coming out again. Okay, and
that's not us. We do buy books.
unless you have questions.
But we do look to buy books, but that's what you bring down.